Hey everybody, Marcus here. So I want to do something a little bit different this time around. I'm going to play a video and then do some commentary on top of it. The subject matter of the video is really about beauty and specifically the absence of it in modern architecture. And I think this video really does a good job in giving exposition about the phenomenon that we register, but really subconsciously. Architecture in the West, specifically in America and Canada, is not at all what it is in Europe. And even in Europe, the modern architecture is not what it was, say, 2, 3, 400 years ago. It's definitely uglier, grayer, more utilitarian, far less, decorative, as it were. And this harkens back to Plato's dialogue entitled Symposium, where Socrates learns about love from Diotema. And a concept is presented in that dialogue entitled The Ladder of Beauty. And the ladder of beauty, how it functions is that by exposing oneself to beautiful objects, you start to see the form of beauty itself and come to love that. And then once you come to love the form of beauty, you can then really abstract out that same love into all forms. And then ultimately that results in wisdom. At least that's how the ladder of Diotema, the ladder of beauty, functions. So let's see how the video goes.
Ugliness, like any pathogen, finds its way into our lives and slowly takes us over from the inside out. A sick society can be felt, much like sickness is felt in our own bodies. However, disease oftentimes doesn't cause alarm until it becomes visual, right? And once it does make its way to the surface, it's usually already in full swing. In a human being, this is represented by a rash, a bump, a lesion. Out in the world, a disease takes the form of a structure. It could be a public work of art, a skyscraper, a bridge. And like disease within our bodies, a person can observe a building and recognize that it is foreign and invasive, that there's something wrong. I think that
This is exactly the same sort of sentiment that I experienced when I was in New York. Everything felt so alien and out of place, really unnerving, created this strange anxiety in me. And even though I was in New York only for a few days, I really wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. I mean, they refer to it as a concrete jungle, but there's this spooky, eerie, unsettling nature about being surrounded by a grid that's completely man-made with nature scattered in orchestrated little small plantations of parks and trees and things like that. There's something definitely very unsettling about that. And I think those people that really gravitate towards things like camping and hiking get that sense, that unease that they don't necessarily consciously register, but that they get it from places that are even less structured than somewhere like New York. So European cities in general, to me at least, have a much more natural vibe to them because the way they were constructed is they were settlements that grew outwards on the periphery, and there was no real central planning like there is in the West, mostly now on a grid.
ugliness is a disease. I think it has pervaded our world. I think it has done this in many ways, but today I'm going to limit myself to just speaking about the environment and architecture. On the most basic level, science will tell you that we respond to physical ugliness with revulsion because we instinctively believe that ugliness is an identifier of disease. And while these studies are mostly referring to humans and animals' physical attributes.
One thing I'd like to interject here actually is out of Nietzsche, is that in Nietzsche's writing, he often harkens back to the way that the upper classes distinguished themselves from the lower classes in society, that one of the big distinguishing markers was cleanliness, specifically that the lower class, because they were always working the fields, because they were usually farmers, they were dirty. And to be elevated, in a sense, was to be clean. And so generally now how we know about ugly people, well, the way people respond to ugly people, there is a sense of unease about it. It's we know that looks play a major factor in relationship to how others treat you. Or so too, when you're diseased, your looks manifest that disease externally, whether that be, a cold sore or whatnot. But very much we do register ugliness differently, and there is a revolting element to it. And it definitely appears in Nietzsche's writing too.
I would take it one step further and say that ugliness can be an identifier of disease, but disease of the mind. And our architecture, our surroundings today reflect a sick society. And of course, in a vicious cycle, the ugly surroundings that we create in turn cause us to conduct ourselves differently for the worse.
And there's also that theory related to the broken window, I think. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but it generally states that if you are in a neighborhood and you see a broken window and no one's fixing it, you have a perception of the neighborhood being more dangerous, but also you're more likely to not do anything to try and clean up that neighborhood. It's the same thing with litter. If you see garbage on the ground, you're more likely to throw garbage onto the ground yourself because, well, nobody cares. And littering apparently is a thing that you do in that area.
What starts out, let's say, as one architect with an awful idea, an ugly idea, and maybe it's a cost-efficient idea. Maybe it's an idea that can be executed quickly. Maybe it solves a whole variety of different functional issues. And therefore, this person does not think that this idea is a bad idea, and they actually think they're coming from a good place. This idea becomes manifest in a building. You could call it a pathogen buried in concrete. And so the years go by, and each person who passes by this building takes a little piece of that building with them, a little piece of that ugliness, that hideous idea with them.
This is also, like this building specifically we see on screen, has a very Soviet vibe to it. And Soviet architecture in Eastern Europe, because I live in Poland, there's still a bit of it around, definitely had that utility-driven architecture allotted to it. There's a chain of apartment buildings in Gdańsk, a northern city out in Poland, which is fairly long. I'd say it's about half a kilometer long, which seems kind of long for a building, but it really is just a chain of group buildings called the Wave Building. And it's hideous. And it was kept in place almost as now a freak show decoration, even though it still has utility. It was basically a tenement. And I remember going by there several times for whatever reasons. And looking at it, it harkens back to that Soviet style of repression. Like you get that very vibe about that structure itself, that this is something meant to demoralize you.
And that idea spreads because those people are affected by that building. And slowly but surely, the idea spreads to other people. And then you start to see a whole array of those ugly buildings erected. And what was once latent is now a full-blown infection. Ugliness affects us. It affects us like a plague does. It behaves like a plague. I say that because once it's understood in this way, it's very easy to identify the stages of its progression and therefore figure out when it's time to intervene, when it's time to take action. And by taking action, I mean bringing beauty back into our lives, prioritizing beauty. Beauty in a world which is plagued by ugliness is the cure. One that we can all afford, too. A little bit of beauty or a lot,
That's the thing about affording beauty, is that a lot of people fear art, and I think Jordan Peterson spoke about this, is that when people decorate their apartments, for example, they stick to beige colors or very neutral, non-identity forming decorations or colors. And that's probably not something great that people surround themselves with, because specifically the interior of their apartment is where they tend to spend most of their time now that people aren't really leaving their house anymore and socializing. So to create an environment for yourself that you find then stifling and are not even aware that it's stifling because it's simply ugly is one of those things that I've given a lot of thought of. And even in my own life, I've definitely taken some care in organizing my immediate surroundings. And also with Jordan Peterson's commentary, the notion of cleaning your room really buys into this notion of beauty being a necessary prerequisite for some form of cleanliness psychologically. That if you clean your room, you feel like there's more order around you, so you're more likely to create that order outside of your room itself.
A conversation about why we need beauty is enough to begin the work of the cure. There are many studies on human behavior in relation to ugliness and beauty, particularly when it comes to environment. You have Roger Ulrich's 1984 study, where patients recovering from surgery recover more quickly when they're placed in front of a window with a scenic natural view. There's Maslow's study in 1956, where the ugliness or beauty of a room changes the way that a subject perceives energy and well-being.
Yeah, like I was saying, the aesthetic of the room. And I think the Asian practice of feng shui really taps into this notion as well, is that you can actually organize the energy within the room itself. And that, it's kind of depressing that the word energy is now thrown around in this kind of new age form, but there really are vibes that come off of places and people and the works of art or videos or whatnot. And so organizing your space, definitely important.
In pictures of others and headshots of people. Interestingly enough, this research only began around the 1950s onward, and Maslow said this himself in the introduction of the study I just mentioned, that the impact of surroundings and aesthetics on people had little to no research. It seems to me that I feel that people for a long time just intrinsically knew that beauty was a necessity, regardless if this was architecture in cities, or if it was a church, or if it was in their own home. And I think because a lot of beauty was, of course, tied to religion and the divine.
Mind you, because we're talking about religion now and architecture of cathedrals, what we see on screen is that not all of the architecture of cathedrals was merely to praise God in terms of an aesthetic representation of one's devotion. There were messages inscribed in some of the architecture, and there's Masonic symbolism, because the Freemasons were commissioned generally to build the cathedrals of Europe. I mean, they were eventually fired and persecuted at one point by the church, but prior to that, they would build in certain architectural quirks into the cathedrals themselves. That's why you see a lot of the European cathedrals have a similar kind of vibe to them. And one of those themes is the triptych, which means that if you were to see the front of a cathedral, what you tend to witness is a larger center door and two smaller kind of center doors that are at the base of two towers that extend upwards. And even in what we see on screen here, we see that there's these two towers on the front of the building, and each of those towers represented an aspect of Masonic belief. Specifically, the left one, I don't remember its name, but the left one related to the moon, the right one to the sun. The moon represented femininity, the right one represented masculinity, and the Masonic message was that the unity, which happened at the center large door and over it, specifically in a rose window, represented the union of the masculine and the feminine element, or more specifically, a unity of opposites. So in terms of architecture, there was definitely knowledge built into it as well. So yeah.
And something higher. Beauty has also been a very clever and very useful political tool. But we live in a very different world now, don't we? Our cities are larger, religious ties are weakening. Even politically, I think that people are confused and they seem to feel aimless. And of course, industry takes precedence over most things. It seems that we had forgotten for a brief moment that beauty was necessary to our general well-being, as if it was kind of hidden behind functionality and instant gratification. And I seriously don't find it any coincidence that it was only a few decades after the Bauhaus's modernism revolutionized our architecture and how our goods are made that the need and desire for that type of research became unavoidable.
I would say that this style, the Bauhaus style, was replaced with IKEA, which is basically the cheaper, crappier version of that exact same style.
It was needed. People were upset and sad and depressed by their surroundings, and they weren't quite sure why or what that connection was. With a society that was bereft of their connection to well-made and well-designed things, we start to see an alarming rise in mental dissonance. And while, yes, there are other factors that are the cause of that, having disorder around you all the time, or boring buildings, ugly environments certainly contribute to a mental illness, mental dissonance. The Bauhaus and modernism in post-war Europe changed the game, possibly irreversibly. This is a modernism which sought to make living, goods, interior design, architecture more affordable. They used new materials, which made it easier to mass manufacture things, so that the average person could rebuild their life and it would change their outlook on life. But unfortunately, it is that sentiment that went so wrong. And I think we can all agree on this, that even though the modernists had good intentions, they didn't age well. And
Yeah, the modernists never really had good intentions per se. Modernity, and I made a video on this a long time ago, was really a response to the nominalist revolution of the 13th century that happened amongst the scholastic philosophers in Europe, amongst the clergy. And modernity in general was a response to answering the ontic priority, the problem of ontic priority that appeared later down once universals were rejected. And architecture itself, I guess, succumbed to it as well, a rejection of the old symbolism, of the old ways of thinking that was somewhat based in the Aristotelian set of thought, and also that the Masons were no longer really involved in the construction of the cathedrals specifically, and usually it was buildings produced by the church and the government that had that aesthetic quality to it. But yeah, modernism, maybe in the aesthetics, it means something a little bit different from the philosophical aspect of it. But modernism was really a panicked response to the collapse of Aristotelian metaphysics, specifically the rejection of universals.
designs are to blame for a lot of the problems that we face today. We are approaching a very dark, very ugly world due to their empathy. It isn't to say that modern design is not good design at some point. It definitely is. However, a lot of it can be quite minimalist and elegant, and that is often misunderstood and abused by the masses whenever it's mass-produced. And eventually it's effaced by laziness and selection of more widely appealing design, which favors less creative solutions and less tedious solutions to problems. Now, when I say less creative, when I say the word disease, what building comes to mind? When you walk down the street, which building pisses you off more rationally maybe than others? What does it look like? What is it called? That's something that I think maybe a lot of people don't know. They don't know what the name of that style is. And there are a few names for it, but one that's quite popular is developer chic. We're talking about...
Yeah, and that exact picture that was just shown of that apartment complex is exactly what modern Polish buildings are being constructed to look like. It is literally a spitting image of the place that I used to live in.
Those housing complexes that seem to have popped up all over,
And these buildings look identical to pretty much every construction project that existed in Ireland, in Dublin specifically, since the 2000s or so.
Have notoriously made it difficult to tell which city you're in, because they're all the same. Developer chic is used to describe this really awful trend in architecture. It's a term that was coined by Kate Wagner. She's the famous author of the McMansion Hell blog, and if you've never looked at that, you're missing out. It's so funny. But yes, that is the phrase that I'm going to use to represent that style, although I even disdain to call it a style. This breed of building is an unprecedented, malignant invasion on all that we hold dear. Now, it's not even that these buildings, larger or smaller versions, variations of them, are even hideous or something. The problem with them is that they're awfully boring. Under the category of ugly, I feel boring is a clearly defined subdivision. Beauty has always been something which stimulates us. Beauty is life-affirming, thrilling, incomprehensible. It takes many forms. That's why it inspires us to be better people. It inspires us to get out of bed, saves many of us from mental illnesses. It surprises us. It gives us hope.
And like I was saying in Diotema's ladder, is that it's through beauty do you get into wisdom. And what she's saying is absolutely true, is that you react to beauty. There's a phenomenon with Japanese tourists, and the Japanese have an obsession with Paris for some reason. And there's a phenomenon that I think it's called Paris syndrome, where Japanese people literally have spasmodic attacks of being overwhelmed and losing consciousness. And since Paris has been transformed from the 2015 migrant crisis, the effect now for Japanese tourists has almost been reversed. Like they get to Paris, they see the filth, and they're devastated and react also in this very real, visceral fashion. Where there have been stories that people have been hospitalized after, well, Japanese tourists have been hospitalized after witnessing what Paris has become.
For a better world. Of course, boring doesn't do that for you. Boring is a flat line. Monotony, predictability, loss of interest, loss of hope. It is for this reason that I believe that boring surroundings within the category of ugly cause us great harm. Boring is a strain of dangerous disease. Boring is often called harmless, so it's left unchecked, like many diseases. Boring, a cousin of ugliness, represents apathy, lack of drive, and eventually a kind of spiritual or metaphorical death, sometimes a literal death. There is nothing harmless about that. The Cut did a nice little article on the effect that boring buildings have on us. This article was talking about the massive Whole Foods that opened up on East Houston Street in Lower Manhattan, and how it negatively affected people who had to witness that and walk by it every day. They linked being surrounded by a growing number of boring buildings to higher stress levels and even a rise in ADHD. They talk about how boring surroundings lack the elements of turmoil and confusion that humans actually desire, because those are components of complexity and thrill, and we even desire this from our architecture. All in all, it seems that variety is the healthiest mode of experience. Developer chic buildings do not have this. They are nonetheless boring. And they are boring as a byproduct of many things, like zoning requirements, building codes, cheap materials which are lightweight and can be shipped easily, design that is tried and true, generic, uncomplicated, which can be copied and pasted in just about any area with no intervention.
And I think we see this with every subdivision that's been constructed since the 50s and 60s in the West, is that all the houses in the subdivision in the suburbs look pretty much the same. And what's gotten actually worse with this architecture since then is that they're no longer built to last. So even the houses that you buy new, they're kind of constructed to have this 30-year shelf life before they really start to fall apart. That was never the case, specifically in Europe, where the buildings were made of materials meant to last. I mean, there's buildings here in the city centers of a majority of the main cities that have over 100-year-old buildings that normal people live in, and they tend to be quite high in demand. And the stereotypes of those places being drafty is not really true anymore. With the minor renovations necessary to insulate the places based on modern developments in insulation, they tend to be much more energy efficient than the modern constructions as well, because they were made of fairly thick, not concrete, but fairly thick brick or whatever the particular material is that they're made out of, but the walls are thick.
These housing complexes, whether they are low-income housing, gentrification red flags, or luxe industrial lofts, they are a result of urban planning, which is a primary problem. Kate Wagner says in a Common Edge article that she did that architecture is not urban planning. So these buildings look the way that they do and have a negative effect on us due to the fact that they are a result of urban planning, whose priorities are a reaction to housing issues, financial problems, and growing populations. So each construction's only goal is really to house people, to do it cheaply, efficiently, quickly, which inevitably sounds like a band-aid fix to a much larger problem. And when buildings with this criteria become more and more prominent, they start to communicate something verging on nihilistic. If developers, in the face of a humanistic problem, continue to produce buildings that make us feel depressed and stressed, which are made cheaply and designed to be temporary, buildings which clearly have no appeal to our desire for beauty, what can that possibly say about the direction of our world, of where we're going? We as a society
Well, where we're going is to fat acceptance, where you can be beautiful at any size. And I know that doesn't really relate to architecture, but it's a disease, ugliness being the disease and the topic of this video. Like she said, she's going to contain it to architecture, but we witness it really pretty much universally. I mean, video game characters are now being made to look ugly. People are hideously ugly, and I'm sorry to say, but last time I was in the U.S., I was in Colorado, in the mountains there, visiting some family, and just walking around one of those local tourist towns and witnessing a diaspora of various Americans from around the U.S., not just from Colorado, but tourists from all around the U.S. Those people were hideous, and they weren't just hideous in that overweight fashion, but that was fairly universal. Most of the people I did see were overweight, but they were ugly in this weird, eerie way where it almost looked like they were burgeoning on deformity, where their eyes weren't exactly parallel. There was a lack of symmetry in their features. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to describe, but definitely it was present there. So ugliness generally seems to be something we're being exposed to, encouraged towards, and this whole lack of shame, lack of judgment that I guess not just the internet, but culture is pushing on people. Don't judge anybody based on their looks or whatnot. Is encouraging this, and to prevent people's feelings from getting hurt, the rest of us need to deal with these eyesores, which are they're causing negative reactions in us. I mean, part of the reason that movies are fun to watch is because they have pretty people in them. Like, it's a big part of it, and aesthetics do matter, both in people and the places. And when learning, say, for example, to film something, I mean, the camera matters a little bit, but it's far more important what you place in front of it and the lighting that you do. So orchestrating beautiful things is not a lost art in the human condition. It just seems to be something that is no longer made accessible to the general public in their day-to-day lives, but only windows of it are made opportune through the media. But even then, the plots are becoming uglier. I mean, generally, ugliness is something that is spreading into pretty much every facet of existence.
Will start to adopt the sentiment which these buildings communicate. What is that sentiment? It can be said as why even bother? Just whatever. I guess that'll do. That's fine. Is that the sentiment? That's what you want your buildings to look like? That's what you want your buildings to communicate? Because that's what they're doing. This is what they scream at us all the time. It is verifiably anti-human. This lack of effort, this disposal of excelsior, which we should be known for as human beings, as animals. It's because of this that I even hate to call developer chic an aesthetic. It's as close as you can get to non-aesthetic, because although these buildings are made for people, they do not feel like spaces intended for people. They lack the aesthetic hallmarks, the appeal to our senses, to our human walk of life, to beauty. I've talked at length about how a major component to beauty and art via William Morris's theories is the humanness of it, a flaw or identifying feature. These developer chic buildings.
Yeah, and this is something I do need to comment on, what she's speaking about, the flaws. This is something that you witness a lot in modern music, is that pretty much everything produced in the last 20 years, when digital audio workstations became the standard for professionally recorded music, everything is set up against a grid. And what this means, back in the old days, the way that music was recorded is, for example, the band was recorded as a whole, or an orchestra was recorded as a whole. So whatever human mistake or humanness appeared inside the performance was what was captured in the recording. So the performances were never flawless. There were little mistakes by some of the musicians that that either pertain to timing or pitch. As well, with an orchestra, it's undoubtedly that somebody was making a mistake somewhere. You would hear noises in relationship to people moving around. So the noise of moving your feet, for example, on the ground, or something to do with the microphone where maybe you spoke too close to it, a sibilant sound. It didn't really matter. Imperfections were naturally captured in the recordings. But with the DAW, what you can do is now lay everything against a grid and then edit down each individual track of, say, a drum kit so that it perfectly aligns in time, which creates this machine phenomenon. And that lack of imperfection is what a lot of people in the music space actually do complain about, is that everything sounds kind of the same because there's no humanity in it. And part of my hypothesis specifically to music and beauty is that the humanness of it is why people actually want to listen to the music to begin with. And this is the best way to describe it is that if I'm listening to, say, a rock song, which is guitar heavy, I'm not interested in hearing the guitars. I'm interested in hearing a specific person play a guitar. And in order for me to hear that person play the guitar, they can't be edited down to a grid. Because once that person is edited down to a grid and everybody else is edited down to a grid, they all sound like the same person now playing, with the minor accentuations in performance. But it doesn't really make a difference there. You lack the humanity, you lose the interest, and you suck out the soul of the medium that you're actually experiencing in front of you. And like I said, in music, it's very much observable.
Buildings and modern buildings of our time are notoriously dull and soulless because they lack this fundamental aspect of what makes things feel so beautiful to us. And that is seeing ourselves in the things that we create. Beauty is known to have a profound personal impact on us. Beauty is not just subjective, but what we know to be beautiful is also an intimate statement about ourselves, who we are individually. It's well known that when someone looks in the mirror and does not find themselves to be beautiful, a disconnect forms called dissociation. This dissociation causes us to lose ownership over our appearance. We look at that form in the mirror and we don't identify with it. If we see ugly buildings all the time, if we are surrounded by more and more ugliness, we will stop identifying with these surroundings, which leads to the notorious sensation of isolation, which modern architecture is guilty of producing.
And this goes even further because on the internet, you have a lot of nihilism happening. You have a lot of that doomer mentality where people just want the world to burn. And I think part of it is because of all the ugliness they witness beyond human activity and behavior, beyond the drama of whatever, the drama related to women and whatnot, and the laws. It's also the actual environment itself is now something people don't want to cling to retain. Is like nobody will care if you level out an entire suburb because there's nothing there to keep. Unlike, for example, something like the Eiffel Tower, which is unique and distinct. Unlike something like, what would you say, the Statue of Liberty, which is an article of beauty, which has something akin to a utility to it, but it's really there to symbolize a spirit, something worth protecting, that you don't want that destroyed. You can level Manhattan, but, leave the Statue of Liberty alone, because that should kind of be there. And when you don't have that in your environment at all, then you just don't care about the environment. So let the world burn.
So today, many of us look around and we do not see ourselves anywhere. We feel adrift, looking for a place to call home in places which are designated as housing, places that are supposed to be designed for us to feel at home. But why does that happen? These buildings are so obviously not built based on our desires, on our need for beauty and variety and thrill. So why do they look this way? Why do they look so ugly? Why do we feel so alienated and sad? The possible reason is because those who built them do not in fact consider us in them at all. Back in 2011, there was a wonderful article called "The Architect Has No Clothes," where Michael Mahaffey and Nikos Salingaros identified this insidious problem with architects. It's a complex and systematic phenomenon called architectural myopia. Salingaros is quoted in an article as saying, "Michael and I coined this term to describe the curious and alarming phenomenon whereby someone who has gone through architecture school can look at a horrid, inhuman structure and declare it to be great architecture. Such persons literally cannot see what is right in front of them. The corollary is also frightening. Those same people look at older historical and vernacular structures and totally miss their intense degree of embedded life and humanity. To such people, old means useless, shameful, and is marked for elimination. Architectural education ever since the Bauhaus, and continuing to the present day without interruption, teaches students to interpret built forms according to very peculiar abstract criteria, and not through their own biologically evolved senses and cognitive intelligence. This is radical training and sensory denial, desensitizing people so that their interpretation of the world can be defined by others with an agenda. But because of this architectural myopia, a large group of people happily accepts the conditioning and doesn't realize what's going on, and they don't understand why others disagree drastically with them."
And I think this is also part related to what Peterson was saying, which I mentioned even previously, about people being afraid of art, is that too many people attribute too much weight to the voice of what they would consider an authority on the subject. So as long as someone is acting the art critique and they contradict the opinion of you, say a layman, you're afraid that you may be wrong. If you're contradicting in terms of what you're experiencing, that which quote unquote expert is telling you about. So when you look at what constitutes even modern art, and people have made fun of modern art, like right now there's some silliness about a banana being duct taped to a wall going for millions, like just silly things like that, a toilet or a painting that's completely white with a little dot in the middle, and people are, critics in that community are praising it as this abstraction and high art. It's all nonsense. All of it's nonsense. And when you detach yourself from that space, from that circle of these critics, and just look at it as if you've just encountered something randomly in a random alley, and it's like, well, that's ugly. It's not art. It's nothing. And people are afraid to voice this because the message coming from the so-called experts is contravening what their own eyes are telling them.
In the original article, now that was just the interview on the article, but in the original article, The Architect Wears No Clothes, they expressed this too. "The phenomenon of architectural myopia may explain the repeated mistakes that architects make in fashioning built environments for others, which turn out to be woefully unsuccessful in what may seem obvious ways to lay people. Lastly, architectural myopia explains the often disastrous attempts that architects have made to fashion urban schemes for entire neighborhoods and cities. Architects do not see how certain designs disconnect and isolate people and create hostile environments that cannot be shared." Now, what they are referring to here is that architects build artistic and obscure buildings without understanding that art isn't always hospitable to the everyday lives of human beings. And although architectural myopia seems to be expressing a more highbrow, fine art end of this overarching issue that I'm talking about here, I would say that developer chic also suffers from its own narrow perspective and nearsightedness. Developer chic's nearsightedness just isn't this proclivity towards fine art. It's a tendency to build shit that's cheap, temporary, and ugly to suffice a burgeoning housing crisis. Both types of architecture succeed at isolating the people which live near or in the structures. However, one camp simply doesn't consider people at all, and the other considers them like farm animals. One camp chooses to live in the present because beauty and art are more important than social congruence. The other lives in the present because they do not believe in a future. And that's obvious. What I'm driving at is that we need beauty now more than ever. We don't need the kind of beauty that isolates people, which is the other end of this spectrum, but we need a little more of it in the middle to balance things out. The more ugly buildings and ugly surroundings I witness, the more worried I get about those which have to live in them. People that don't even know anything about architecture, that have no idea what this what looking at this kind of thing can do to them on a daily basis. I worry about how it will change them. How much longer will they live before they come down with a case of the blues, where they're just so diseased enough to even ask what the point of it all is? Because I hear this in conversation with people all the time already, and with young people. A society that rejects beauty because it's too much effort is doomed. And with all of the diseases over the centuries that have taken the lives of billions of people, trillions of people, due to the lack of no known cure, I sure hope we can lift up our head to realize that the cure is right there in front of us, ready to be taken. Beauty is waiting for us. We need only reach for it.
Okay, so that's basically the end of the video. But the takeaway out of it, because it's witnessable pretty much in everything, in the cars that are being produced now, they don't have that sex appeal of something coming out even of the 70s. I mean, if you look at, say, the Corvettes that were the C3 Corvette, that was, I think, manufactured in 73, 74, something around that. And you look at what's coming out that's more modern, they lack that class that used to exist. Same thing with the architecture, same thing with media, same thing with how people present themselves externally. I mean, there's a phenomenon happening now where Gen Z is aging rapidly. I mean, I'm in my 40s and I have been confused for somebody in my late 20s countless times, and always by young people. And I'm talking about people 17, 18, 19-year-old that will talk to me like I'm one of their peers. And I tell them I'm like 40, 42 years old. And they say, well, you don't look, you look like one of us. I would say 27, 28, which isn't really a claim to me looking young. It's a claim to this new generation looking old. And the same phenomenon has happened multiple times where I've confused a Zoomer that was 17, 18 for somebody in their mid-20s, potentially even pushing 30. There was a girl at the gym that I go to that when Adrian was down visiting me, him and I would go to the gym together. And we didn't really know her age. And at one point, Adrian and I were having a conversation about her. And I asked him, it's like, how old do you think she is? And he said, well, she's probably like 32. I'm like, really? Well, I think she's like probably 27, 28, maybe 29. Eventually, we found out she was 22 years old. I mean, my nephew, the same age as her, because he was 22, thought she was a decade older than what she looked like. And I thought she was at least 6, 7 years older than what she looked like. And Zoomers are commenting on this, that they appear to be aging faster than the younger, than the older generations are. And so for me, a 40-year-old man, I look like a Zoomer in his mid-20s now, which is absolutely shocking. But the thing about it, why I bring up the age aspect of it, is that aging typically makes you a little bit uglier. I mean, with men, if you keep in shape, you get a bit of that gravitas. Your countenance kind of becomes more masculine because the loss of monotony is not so much a big problem. But for women, I mean, the wall. And so for a woman to hit the wall in our perception at age 22, and you imagine now being surrounded by 21, 22-year-olds that look like they're past the wall. I mean, that's shocking. So yes, people are getting uglier beyond just the weight. I think it's the diet, it's the air, it's the water we're drinking. The cars are uglier. I mean, Tesla's products are hideous. Whatever that van or truck that he put out recently looked like some sort of bastardized version of a Coca-Cola can. It was absolutely hideous. So the cars are getting hideous. Architecture is getting hideous. Just generally, we're in a very ugly world. And if Diotema's ladder is at all in any way true, which this woman is suggesting there's truth in it, I'm suggesting there's truth in it, so did Plato suggest there was truth in it. We are in existence in an environment that is naturally discouraging philosophical and spiritual growth. Thanks for listening. Go team.